seems like here in Canada, the situation is pretty dire. And, especially in Quebec, Montreal is like, it has a long history of rioting and protesting. So it's certainly not out of the question. And we've already seen like just right wing anti mask, anti lockdown protests last year. Um, Speculated to be mostly from people out of the city, um, coming into the city in order to, make a big stink. But it's not out of the question that there's some kind of like cross coalition, if we can call it that, anti-lockdown protest that erupts this summer. Um, and that could potentially spread because the situation in Montreal, it's like not doesn't seem to be getting better in any meaningful sense. Like it just keeps going back and forth, and like now there's like a third wave that is underway. It's really does not seem to be improving at all, and people are understandably losing their minds about it. um but and I could see that perhaps spreading across Canada, or at least to some of the other, like Toronto, for example. Ontario has undergone like another like 30-day extreme lockdown because cases are spiking out of control. Here in Vancouver, we have this like circuit breaker. Like cases are like relatively quite low, but cases are going up here. So yeah, I could see, but there's also like a very like vocal and prominent right wing kind of like conservative reactionary QAnon contingent here in Vancouver. It's really remarkable. Like I don't know much about this city really, but I feel like the kind of like reactionary people um, are a lot more vocal, and make themselves a lot more heard. At least they're probably more powerful than any kind of like left-wing contingent. But yeah, I could see something spreading across Canada. But in the United States, apparently from what I know, like the vaccine rollout is actually going quite well, and they seem to be dealing with it better at this stage. Like cases are going down. Apparently, like Coney Island has opened back up. Um, yeah, like different states are dealing with it differently. Like spring break in Florida is going out of control, and people are just like rampaging around through the countryside. Like spring breakers are just literally like rampaging through the countryside. But Florida never had any kind of lockdown, as far as I can know, as far as I could tell. Like there was like like very vocal kind of like the government itself was anti-mask, and they never really instituted any kind of like strict policies regarding masks or lockdowns or closures or anything like that. So yeah, it seems like maybe less likely that COVID is a catalyst for any kind of like protest wave in the United States this summer, just because, yeah, they've been doing the vaccine rollout far more effectively. It seems like they're, getting a handle on it. Maybe it is probably too early to really say that, but there's seems like there's at least like the public opinion is that they have a handle on it far more than the Canadian government does, or at least like Quebec and like some of the local Canadian governments do. But anyway, there is the other situation here, which is the Derek Chauvin trial. Derek Chauvin was the guy who killed George Floyd and set off that wave of riots last summer. So you have been following it a little bit, Owen, and you said that. Do you want to fill us in a little bit on what's
Yeah.
going on there?
Well, like the trial's going on right now, and like obviously it's still very like up in the air, like what the ultimate verdict will be. Like if you look at like different news sources, they seem to have like very different opinions about like how the trial is proceeding. Um, but like just the fact that it's up in the air is like already concerning. Like I think there is like a case being made that, you know, it's not as clear cut as it might have appeared in that initial video. Like he might not get charged with murder because there's like other factors that need to be considered. So like I think there's like a significant non-zero chance that like this guy gets off without murder. And like I won't get into like the morality of that, or like, you know, like whether or not he should, but I'm just recognizing that like if he doesn't get charged with murder, there's obviously going to be like a big protest against that. Like a lot of people will be really upset because I think like in a lot of people's minds, like no matter what verdict the trial reaches, like, you know, they got all the trial they needed when they saw that footage last year. Like, you know, it seemed pretty clear cut. And if he gets off, like even if he gets off with like a manslaughter charge, that's just going to be seen as like further proof of like the injustice of the system and like the corruption of law enforcement and like systematic like white supremacy. And like I don't know if it'll go to the same extent that it did last year, but I certainly see like a pretty strong likelihood of like another protest wave in the near future, like basically as soon as this trial concludes.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about, whether or not it would have the same kind of force. Because like last summer, you had like the COVID measures were like fully in effect, and people were quite frustrated over what was happening to them, over like all of their economic like inequality, and like it was mostly like a proletarian protest, and a protest from people who are most economically impacted by COVID regulations, and by like the I guess less so by the like shift from uh like small businesses up to major corporations. Like you didn't have like small business owners participating in the protest in the same kind of way. They were doing their own protest like separately, but it was not part of the umbrella of the George Floyd protest. But anyway, this is all to say that like that huge like protest that at some point started like building into this kind of like um gunfire, like one side shooting members of the other side, and then like a few days later there would be a retaliation shooting, like a kind of tit for tat um like escalation of like actual death and gunfire, is like how those protests started playing out. But that was definitely like precipitated by all of these frustrations around the pandemic measures, um, as well as obviously like the injustice of the George Floyd killing, and there are like many other killings that happened over the course of the summer that kind of just like added fuel to the fire, and caused it to continue for as long as it did. But there seems to be some mollification. I feel like this is probably too soon to say. Like I feel like we're probably only now feeling some of the significant economic fallout of last summer, like meaning that there are probably a lot more homeless people now, and a lot more people who are just like extremely economically precarious, people who are lining up at food banks um, than there were last, as a result of the institution of all these COVID measures last year. So just because the Americans are doing a decent job rolling out the vaccine, this does not necessarily mean that the fire of discontent is still burning within the heart of the American proletariat, and they are not going to erupt into a massive wave of protests over the whatever verdict is reached by the Derek Chauvin trial. um
Yeah. I mean,
yeah.
like, I do see like maybe two sort of broader, more abstract like sources of frustration. And this, of course, isn't limited to America, but like One is just like the general like lack of like, any sort of like expectation of like long-term happiness amongst like millennials and Gen Z. Like basically like our whole adult lives have been like this experience of like recognizing like the untenability of like the dream that we were conditioned to like chase when we were kids. Like this idea that you could just go get like a university degree and then you'd get like a satisfying career and you'd be able to like get a house and get married and have kids if you want to, like basically just follow the standard script that's been running for the last century or so. And like, with each successive year of like at least the last decade, like at least since around the time of like the 2008 recession, it's just becoming more and more clear cut that like there's like no, at present at least, there's like no foundation on which to base that dream, and it's increasingly just seeming like, oh yeah, you're gonna like work bullshit minimum wage jobs for the rest of your life and like probably just live in like a small apartment in like a dense urban like metropolis and like just like consume mass produced media and food stuff. And like I think more and more people are like beginning to like really experience frustration with that, where like, like 10 years ago being like a libertarian in the United States was a pretty common like way of identifying yourself, and now it's like, like socialism is pretty much like something that everybody's at least interested in, things like UBI. Like I think there's just this increasing feeling that like something's got to change, because like the prospect that we're looking at of just like another several decades of like what 2010s were like but worse is just like a no-go for many people. So I think you're going to see protests against that from like pretty much everyone under the age of 40. But then there's also like, and maybe this is more of like a conservative patriot mindset, but I think there is this feeling in the United States that like, America used to be the top dog and now it's like, it's kind of like fragmenting, and China's rising more and more to prominence, and it feels more and more like these like global corporations are kind of starting to distance themselves from like the American infrastructure. And I think there's like this feeling of like betrayal with Americans towards like, well, towards like tech corporations, towards globalism more broadly, towards China. And there's like this reactionary kind of patriotic like feeling like they need to stand up and like show that they're still the best, that America's still the greatest. Like, I mean, this is basically why Donald Trump won. That was like his entire campaign platform was like, oh, something's gone wrong. We need to make America like the best again. So I do think you're going to see like
Make
a pretty
America great
significant like
again.
make America great again. Thank you. How could I forget a slogan like that? You're going to see like a pretty significant reactionary pushback. And I think that's going to grow too, because like as the situation gets worse, it's going to, this is how like reactionary pushbacks always like gain ground, is because they offer like sort of seductive, idealistic vision of what could be. And the worse the actual situation gets, the better that other option seems to look.
All right. So, as a means of like segueing into our text today, which is the really excellently written essay Error by Endnotes, um, let's try to imagine what would happen if there were a kind of sequel to last year's riot waves. It didn't, I mean, like what was the biggest kind of lesson that came out of that experience? It was probably the Chaz chop. Like that was kind of like the most popular kind of experiment in some sort of like revolutionary organization. Like aside from that, what else was it? There was a lot of like really taking it to the police. Like there are fair amount of examples of like burning down police stations and whatnot, and really like doing battle with the police and with Department of Homeland Security and whatnot. um, but there were not too many, to my knowledge, kind of like experiments in revolutionary organization or
Mm.
experiments in kind of like that kind of like form of living or protesting or whatever. So like what have we really learned from last year? I mean, we've certainly learned uh as ever, like each kind of like riot wave teaches us to take these things more seriously, to be more well prepared, more well equipped. There's a lot of like death and destruction of human bodies last year, which is really difficult to watch the videos of the protests. Like they're just so much like indiscriminate violence coming from the police, coming from the reactionaries fighting back. Yeah, so hopefully there's like people have learned to be more well prepared when going out to these protests. Like that is something that we always hope for, is for people to be prepared and not take these things lightly. But what else have we learned? I don't feel like there's too much. Like where would a sequel have to go? um like what is the strategy that has been like kind of put forward? Not much. Like that, those protests really followed like a pretty similar path of like all protests. I guess like another kind of like victory or success was just getting defund the police out there. That became like a big catchphrase. It really exploded. But then, it also didn't accomplish anything, and the police
Mm.
have not been defunded. And Biden has said that he will not defund the police. Trudeau has said that he will not defund the police. All the other, Canadian opposition party leaders have said that they do not support defunding the police. Like that is not something that any kind of like politician wants to do, even though uh, like it has a lot of support from the surplus populations and from the proletariat in general. So that is perhaps another lesson, is like just continue to repeat that refrain, and hopefully it will sink into the heads of the people who control the levers of power. But there's not really been any like innovation in terms of mass access, gaining mass access to those levers of power.
Mm.
So that is my attempt to segue into this episode, which does deal with the question of strategy. That seems to be a theme in the essay, is like you know the like the kind of topic that it's dealing with is technology more broadly, but it is dealing with questions of strategy, and it kind of um follows up, for me at least. It's kind of like a response to the essay on logistics in a way, like indirectly, even though it's not cited. Like that essay kind of put forward that there are certain technologies that absolutely have, like logistics, that have absolutely no place within communism. They are not. They're fully like expressions of the capitalist mode of production, and insofar as we are reliant upon them, we need to break our reliance from them. And this essay, like one of the big questions that it's dealing with, is the question of technological neutrality, and like how to deal with certain technologies, the entire infrastructure that capitalism has built up for itself over centuries. And dealing with the questions of that infrastructure's neutrality, and how are we to parse the good from the bad? How do we deal with these sorts of oppressive technologies that kind of run our everyday life, and kind of like developing a bit of a strategy for how to deal with that. So, Owen, do you have any kind of like preliminary remarks on this essay? Do you want to try to like give a bit of a your own bit of a summary of it?
Yeah, okay. Well, it's another good essay. Like so far, this volume of Endnotes is 2 for 2 for like introducing interesting new concepts. And I think like this one actually really explores in depth something that we've brought up on the podcast a couple times ourselves, just like from reading other essays and kind of intuiting like similar ideas, which is basically this like sort of complex philosophical or sociological problem where like the capitalist relation kind of like causes technology to develop in a certain way, and like the way that the technology develops builds up like certain like material structures in society in terms of like how cities are organized, in terms of how like machinery is designed, in terms of like the, you know, the managing logic of corporations and factories and like energy sources and things like that. It creates like this vast systematic infrastructure which in turn like informs the way the individual interacts with the world. Like your horizon of possibilities is like heavily colored by like the actual material conditions that you inhabit. Like, you know, the sort of intuitions you're going to derive, like even the way you would like conceptualize like some sort of like radically other like revolutionary utopia is going to be informed by like the actualities of the world you inhabit. And because of this, the idea is that like it's sort of like this feedback loop where like technological developments just further reinforces the capitalist mechanism. It basically causes people to keep reproducing the same conditions over and over, which leads to this big problem where, okay, so you want to do a revolution. How do you go about doing that? How do you actually like break from this pattern instead of just kind of like continuing on capitalism by any other name? Um, and you know, like one tempting solution that I think you'll hear offered up from time to time by like Luddites and like you know, like anarcho primitivists is like, oh, we're just gonna like bring it all down. We're gonna like, you know, revert to like just being like agrarians or something. We're gonna have like a really diminished like technological load, like basically like the Ted Kaczynski position. The problem with that is that realistically, like if you were to try to like, you know, just like abruptly change all of the material technological infrastructure that's been built up, like that would result in millions of people dying. Like the vast majority of people on Earth, like basically wouldn't know how to survive in anything other than like current technological infrastructure. So at the very least, if you wanted to move away from that, it would require like a very long process of like disassembling it. So I think the question being explored here then is like, what can you do? What are your possibilities for like inserting yourself in this like reproductive cycle of technology and kind of like diverting the course without on the one hand just kind of like reproducing it in the same fashion, or on the other hand just like trying to radically destabilize it in a way that like, you know, isn't really in anyone's interest aside from maybe like the Unabomber.
Yeah, it's funny how they I forget the direct citation, but they talk about how in one of the footnotes how there's like this Harvard sociologist who is like repeating the kind of same position as the Unabomber. Do you remember
Yeah,
that?
well, the weird thing about the Unabomber is he actually does have like a following. Like I think it's mainly like eco-fascist, but like Ted Kaczynski, the Unabomber, is like a very like intelligent in the sense of like high IQ kind of individual. So he's written a number of books that are like, you know, very far right kind of like anti-liberal worldview, but they're also like, you know, fairly well articulated. Like he's not just like a ranting madman that you would have expected from the Unabomber, maybe. Like he argues his position in a way that if you're like even a little amicable to his worldview, like it's going to be compelling. So like
Yeah.
it is kind of a weird thing that he does seem to have like a fairly serious following, at least amongst like certain groups.
Yeah. I want to actually read this little excerpt from the Unabomber Manifesto, um, published in the New York Times, 26th May 1996. The degree of personal freedom that exists in a society is determined more by the economic and technological structure of the society than by its laws or its form of government. Most of the Indian nations of New England were monarchies, and many of the cities of the Italian Renaissance were controlled by dictators. But these societies allowed far more personal freedom than our society does. In part, this was because they lacked efficient mechanisms for enforcing the ruler's will. There were no modern, well organized police forces, no rapid long distance communications, no surveillance cameras, no dossiers of information about the lives of average citizens. Hence, it was relatively easy to evade control. It's pretty funny quote because of how like absolutely true it is.
Yeah, well, that's he does articulate, like I think he draws like kind of like this Heideggerian, or maybe like I know he's inspired by like Jacques Ellul's writing on technology, where like all of these figures are kind of recognizing that like, you know, all of this technological progress is sold to us as like an opening up of like potentialities of like, oh look, you have all of these new gadgets, you can do all of this stuff you couldn't do before. But really, like, technological development does something to the human mind. It like basically puts you into this like organized process where everything's essentially reduced to like quantities and ones and zeros and like fit into like this one singular like market mediated framework. And like, even though like on the surface, superficially, it appears like you have more options in terms of like the things you can do, like on a qualitative level, like your freedom is actually like increasingly reduced as everything just begins to feel like you're entering data into an Excel spreadsheet, whether you're like going to a tropical resort on the other side of the world, or like emulating like the hedonistic lifestyle you've seen portrayed in a music video, or like actualizing yourself as like an artistic content creator. Like it all just begins to feel like more like data algorithms manifesting.
Yeah, so for me, one of the more interesting kind of like topics explored in this essay, I mean, typically like there are a lot of questions at play here, and it goes from like very concrete in a literal sense, like discussing how architecture and technology, like the technology of everyday life, determines to some extent our possibilities for action. It also moves to a more abstract kind of like philosophical level, and there's some discussion of like infinity, or like infinite beings, and some reference to like ancient like Greek cosmologies. And yeah, I found that question pretty interesting, like the question of like there's like a distinction made between types of infinite beings. An infinite being does not need to be infinite in both directions. It can potentially have come into being at a definite point, but then like continue infinitely, or it could end at some point but have no like a finite origin point, which is a bit more difficult to wrap your head around. It like kind of messes with your conception of time. But yeah, there are different types of like infinite being. We don't have to assume that if we like posit an infinite being, then we don't have to assume that it extends infinitely in both directions, into the past as well as into the future. And this is relevant to the discussion of capitalism, because there's this real like problem. It's a problem that they're grappling with throughout this text of like, capitalism is a kind of infinite being, or at least that is how it feels when you are inside of it. Like it has an origin, although like they even seem to be grappling with whether or not, like how exactly you can pinpoint its origin point. But presumably it has some kind of origin point, because we know that capitalism was not how things were produced in earlier historical epochs. So perhaps it's a bit more difficult to nail down the precise date at which capitalism came into being, but it must have. And the point there is that it's likely a process. Like it didn't come into being as a totality all at once, maybe as a logical totality, but not as like a material kind of social totality. So there's probably like a firm or whatever that started being capitalist, and then at the same time they're like peasantry and feudal lords and whatnot, and then the capitalist way of doing things kind of like took hold and spread, and eventually gave us the world that built up the world that we are now cursed with, where everything is imbricated within this capitalist totality. But like the way that it sets itself up as this kind of totality is like very challenging thing to deal with, especially as a revolutionary. Like how do you break free from this kind of like universal thing that seems to be, it's like this reproductive cycle, it's like this hamster wheel that you're trapped in, and which comprises all of creation. There's no way to really get out of it. And that seems to be like the question that they're dealing with in this essay, at least in part, is like, at what point can you like enter into capitalism and kind of like from there disrupt it in such a way, and like that you're able to bring it out of being, cause it to no longer exist, no longer be the social totality that we are all trapped within. So yeah, that's kind of like an interesting philosophical question for me. I don't know, what do you think of this, Owen?
Yeah, well, like all of these, like, these more abstract questions of like infinity and like temporality, I think it is speaking to like this sort of shift in like social structure and worldview that has emerged, perhaps because of capitalism. I know like they reference Jacques Ellul's The Technological Society in this article, which is actually a book that I read part of earlier this year. It's a very long book. I haven't finished it yet. But one thing for Ellul, like he sort of articulates the same process that seems to be going on with capitalism, but he doesn't pin it to capitalism. He goes much further back to like technological development itself. Like he describes like technique in a certain particular way, like this sort of like progress and efficiency oriented view of the world, where like you have these technologies and you're endlessly improving upon them. And like this has been the reality of our species for like thousands of years. Like I don't know like the history of it. This sort of like linear directionality, this like kind of like this historical view of the world, basically. But something that Ellul points out is that, if you look at like the entire like history of like biologically modern humans, like for the vast majority of our existence on this planet, it was not like that. For the vast majority of time that we've been like, like fully like cognitively capable of like everything we are currently, we weren't in technological society. We were just like these hunter-gatherer tribes with like no like fixed living spaces, and not really much technology beyond maybe some like basic cutting tools and spears and like some rituals and traditions that were maintained. And there was like a different understanding of time. Like time was seen as cyclic. It was seen as just something that repeats, maybe according to like seasonal cycles, or to like the average like flow of a person's lifetime. There wasn't this sense of like history compounding itself and becoming more complex and developing. And this is something that they don't reference it in this article, but like Deleuze and Guattari's book Anti-Oedipus really explores this topic, how for the vast majority of history you did have this like more cyclic kind of like tradition oriented view of time, and capitalism and perhaps technology sort of represents like what all of those cycles were protecting against, which is like kind of a general destratification of any sort of like fixed meaning or sense of like qualitative importance in life. like what capitalism represents for Deleuze and Guattari is kind of like everything kind of like melting and losing any sort of importance beyond like market mediated logic. Everything just becomes like a product in the global marketplace. Like capitalism like seeps into anything and turns it into like a commodity. And once you've gotten to this point where it's kind of like permeated the entire globe, and like, you know, most people on earth are kind of like moving according to its logic, it begins to feel like very difficult to get out of that. Like I think for like, you know, a right-wing traditionalist, their solution is like, okay, yeah, this is bad, let's just go back to what we had before. But you can't really do that once you've been infected with capitalism. It'll just be sold to you as like a simulacra product. So I think it's like the project of the left is to be like, all right, this seems really bad. We don't know how to get out of this, but like we got to keep looking for a way.
Yeah, I mean, the conclusion of the essay, I feel like it's trying to hit an optimistic note like the last one, but it's a bit ambiguous. We'll get to it. But for now, I want to move to like some of the more kind of concrete examples, some of the more the less abstract considerations at play here. So one of the examples that they give of like one of the questions that they are dealing with is the neutrality of technology. Capitalism is built upon technology. This mode of production is built upon technology, and one of its processes is to constantly be shedding off labor by and like increasing profit by augmenting its own technology, and continually producing value at a more efficient rate, which is accomplished by through the process of real subsumption, which is essentially increasing uh, the technological force of production, and making things more efficient, and thereby as a side effect shedding off labor. It's a kind of like a thing that we've spoken about many times before. It's in Endnotes from the beginning. It's in Marx. But yeah, so one of the questions that they're dealing with is the neutrality of technology, whether or not we can say technology as a whole is neutral, or whether or not we can say that particular technologies are neutral. And ultimately, I think their conclusion is that you have to deal with it on a case by case basis, because some of the examples given, let's see, they talk about how like one of the like in the early 20th century, some like politician in Long Island um, enforced like low hanging overpasses on all of the like bridges, or like entryways into Long Island, which made it impossible for buses to get there, which made it impossible for like low income people to enter into Long Island, because he um, like built all these low hanging overpasses. And this is part of like an overall point, like a pretty obvious point, which is that architecture is obviously non-neutral. Architecture serves like a specific function. It cannot help but direct people, guide people. um, you can pretend that you're a liberal in your construction of a building, and that the direction in which you're guiding people is in itself neutral. But the fact is that you're forced to conform to the directionality and to the kind of like spatial layout of architecture, the architecture that we live in. Another example is bathtubs. Do you remember this,
Yeah,
Owen?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
they
yeah.
talk about how like bathtubs are a form of like non-neutral technology. Another kind of example that they take up towards the end of the essay is the internet. They just generally start talking about kind of internet and network kind of technologies. And one of the things that we can think about is the TCP/IP protocol, which is Yeah, it's basically just like a protocol that computers use to connect to the internet, to the web specifically. And I can't really get into the deep technicalities of it, but like IP stands for Internet Protocol. It's like every computer's like unique identifier. It basically just allows computers to connect to the internet, but it's like a technological protocol that kind of like underlies uh, all of the internet, all of the web, all of the kind of like internet services that we use. um, and it's a protocol which is like like a kind of like specific kind of thing. It's essentially optional. Like you don't really need, you could invent your own protocol to connect to the internet. Is just a matter of like getting the servers to adopt it as well and getting other users to adopt that. Protocol is really just like a convention. It's like a standardized kind of way of doing things. And in a way it becomes like obligatory because it's built into the computers and mobile phones and the operating systems and the web browsers that we all use. So we don't really have an option of opting out unless we know how to. But yeah, protocol is like a kind of it is in a way like an essentially kind of neutral form of technology. But their point here with regards to the internet is that TCP/IP is this like underlying kind of like foundational structure to how the internet functions, to how computers are able to communicate with each other, that is neutral. But upon it are built all of these like absolutely non-neutral structures. They're really just taking advantage of a lot of things that have been developed that are neutral and which are developed for free. Like most of the internet runs on free software. It's pretty remarkable if you think about it. Most of these like companies that are generating, that are like the major players in the global economy right now, the tech companies, are running off of free software that has been developed for free over the 90s, the 80s, and the 90s. Like Linux is the de facto kind of software that basically every internet server runs, all of these whatever. But yeah, so these are like kind of neutral forms of technology, but the fact is that they have been rendered non-neutral. They've been like, neutral really just means ambiguous. It could go either direction. And the fact is that we live within capitalism, so obviously they're being used towards capitalistic ends. Um, but they could be used towards communist ends, I guess is the point. So what do you think of this, Owen?
Okay, yeah, there's like this interesting idea that they put forward that like technological developments, like they tend to mold like what comes afterwards. Like technological developments don't just come randomly like out of nowhere from like pure inspiration, but rather they're like usually built up out of like strata of like previous technological developments. Like the particular like form that new things will take will be based on like recombinations of like things that were made previously. Like there's this like myth that's popular in America of like the isolated genius who's just kind of like tinkering in his basement and he comes up with this like completely new idea that nobody's thought of before, and it just sort of it came down from the heavens, from like the muse, and it just changes everything. When in reality, like technology tends to develop like I think like like information technology is a perfect example. I read like a book about like the history of the MP3 file format recently, and like if you actually look at something like the MP3 file format, there's like references to like developments and like technology from like 100 years ago, like certain ways of like organizing sound information and like parsing digital data and like how it's like categorized, that inform like all later developments of new technologies. So like technology is always building up upon previous technology. And actually this ties in with like I've been reading like Joseph Schumpeter lately, and he does like a really interesting kind of interpretation of Marx, where he says that like the primary importance of Marx's work is that Marx recognizes like the economic motor at play in like historical progress, where there's like this process going on where at any given moment in time, the individual will feel like they're just making rational choices based on like, what's available to them. But if you like zoom out and look at like the broader historical perspective, well, clearly the choices that are available to that individual are, they're there because of things that happened previously. Like the conditions that the individual finds themselves in are all like mediated by like the choices individuals made previously. And not only that, like the horizons that the individual is looking towards are also mediated by like the conditions that they're brought up in. So there is this kind of like linear unfolding of technological development. Like the way I would almost think of it is like, if you were going to divert the course of a river, right? You're not just changing it at the point where you're making the diversion, like where you're like, I don't know, putting a big boulder in the river and then digging a trench that goes in a new direction. You're not just changing the river there, you're changing like the entire future course of the river. Like the river is going to go in an entirely new direction for the rest of its flow to the ocean. And it's the same thing with technology. So they put forward this really interesting idea that you almost need to treat any sort of technological or like, infrastructural decision as if it were a political decision. Because if you say where you decide to make a highway is going to like open up certain possibilities for people based on like where they live in relation to the highway or like what they have access to. The way you design a product will determine how people use it, like what ends they put it towards. And not only that, but like the sorts of people that will even be able to use it. Like, it's like classic examples, like people in wheelchairs probably can't use a lot of stuff. Like it really, their horizons are limited. Like the where you decide to build buildings, like the way you decide to organize anything infrastructurally is not just going to impact like the day-to-day operation of like what it is you're trying to do right now, but it's going to redirect the entire future course of like, people's lives. So I found that really interesting. Like it's not something that you really like look at and draw like immediate conclusions from, but it's more just like an interesting question that makes you like ponder and reflect upon it and maybe see if there's like anywhere you can like apply it in your own life.
Yeah, absolutely. Changing the course of a river. Yeah, it's I feel like it's not entirely common to think of building a highway as a kind of technological decision. But yeah, I guess like city planning is really like a function of technology. It's like it's a perfect, synthesis of politics and technology at the same time. It's like, it should be clear to everybody that city planning is political. You're, like telling people where they're going to live and like, yeah, what they have access to, etc. But it's also highly, mediated by technology, and especially by like scientific kind of like ideas about how to plan out cities and whatnot, and how to plan out public infrastructure and all that sort of thing. But yeah, to try to kind of like bring this back of technology.
Yeah,
Can you still hear
cut
me?
out for a second, but now you're back.
So the question of technology and how it kind of relates to this question of like this cycle of capitalist reproduction, this cycle of the reproduction of the capitalist social relations. I mean, capitalism is essentially a form of technology. It is like made possible through real material technologies. Even from its earliest point, it was made possible through like machinery, as well as like techniques, like technology in a more abstract sense, like techne or whatever, like ways of doing things, ways of like manipulating material things physical objects and whatnot. And then, in a more contemporary sense, like obviously capitalism is like a technological question, because you know everything that we have, all of civilization, has been developed over the course of centuries, again, um, in this kind of like technological fashion, like this increasing kind of refining and making the forces of production more and more efficient. So yeah, I mean, like capitalism is obviously, it should be clear, like essentially tied up with questions of technology, because unless you have these kind of machines that are producing commodities for exchange, for the explicit purpose of exchange, I mean, that is like the distinction between subsistence production and kind of producing value for exchange. You're using machinery to produce commodities at a greater rate than is necessary for pure subsistence. So all of these like machines, all of the kind of infrastructure and the factories and manufacturing and everything that we have in the world today is geared towards, has been developed over the course of centuries to be more and more efficient, more and more advanced, so that we can produce more things than are strictly necessary in order to sustain ourselves as a human species. We are producing things that we can have a surplus of, so that we can exchange them and produce value. So the question is like, how do you kind of like enter into that and disrupt it? How to add like a kind of technological level? I mean, how do you like, yeah, parse out what is good tech and what is bad tech? And
Mm,
the question are like how we can relate this back to what we were discussing earlier, like the George Floyd protests and the potential of like a new um riot wave, and like kind of like thinking about strategies and like directions that such a movement could go in. I feel like, I mean, I don't know. What do you think here? Like the question is like, what is the strategy of this movement? How is it going to effectively kind of like disrupt capitalism? How is it going to become revolutionary? And the answer, I guess, is like it has to address itself to technology in some kind of way. It has
mm,
to figure out how to kind of like the movement needs to figure out what part of the infrastructure it needs to insert itself into in order to accomplish some end, the end of course being revolution. But like, what do you think of this, Owen?
yeah, well, I'm gonna bring a lull in here again because like his book's called The Technological Society, but he actually spends most of it talking more specifically about technique, which is basically like the way of interacting the world, the way of seeing the world that produces technology, the sort of like orientation of being. I think Endnotes in this article, like they reference machinery itself as like opening up the possibility of capitalism, like of capitalism as a distinct potentiality. Because like, if you imagine in like a more archaic society where you say just have the individual worker of any sort, although they wouldn't conceptualize themselves as a worker who just has like their hand tools and anything they want to make, they kind of got to make it by hand, and maybe they have like a little hammer and a little cutting device, but they don't really have anything that makes the job like incredibly efficient. So it's like this laborious process, but more importantly, it's a process that they are overseeing themselves. Like insofar as they have tools, they're very like rudimentary tools that they probably like keep on their person. So it's whatever they're producing is like really just their own creation. It's something that they're overseeing. It's something that they're like making for their own personal usage. As soon as you start introducing machinery that like changes the production process of anything, suddenly there's this shift where it's not so much like the actual worker who's making the product that has full say and full control over that product, as it is the person who controls the machinery, because the machinery can produce the product so much more efficiently than any individual worker with their rudimentary tools could. So this potentiality not only of like a capitalist class that isn't actually doing the work, but they control like the most effective means of reproduction, suddenly having power, that emerges with technology. But also there is this idea of creating like a surplus beyond basic survival, because in a traditional hunter-gatherer society, you know, it'd be so effortful to just make one thing that you wouldn't really ever like make a super abundance. Like maybe you'd make a little bit extra for hard times, but you wouldn't dream of just creating like tens of thousands of identical units of something. This is the potential that opens up under capitalism thanks to machinery. So like the problem isn't so much machinery itself, isn't so much technology itself, as this kind of like technique of engaging with life, as like this idea of like progress becoming the primary motivating force of anything one does, of like this accumulation of further efficiency, further technological development, just vast amounts of like commodity stock that you can use to increase your capitalist status. This has become like the driving logic of everything in our society. And I think like if you want to really do revolution, that's what you've got to attack. It's not so much about like the actual like mechanical infrastructure, because we can see intuitively that there's other ways it could be used. You know, there's a lot of like nice things about having some degree of technology, like, you know, maybe having like a vehicle that can take you to the other side of the world would be a good thing to have. You know, having like certain like modern farming techniques would be useful. Like, you know, like we're not advocating for people to be hunter gatherers again. We want to be able to preserve some degree of technological development. We just want to decouple it from this mindset that has like developed like in concordance with it, which is like, you know, just like puts like quantification and endless like efficiency development as being the primary goal of anything. So I guess
Yeah.
that's not really an answer, but like I recognize that as being like the central problem. Like, how do we decouple what we've already developed from like this like cancerous drive to just keep endlessly producing?
Yeah, at some point they quote, I forget if it's Dove or Kamat. It's like one of the, one of those guys, like one of the big kind of communizer guys. Um, and he's basically saying that like we want like decentralization of like power, for example, but we don't want like every household to be like its own power plant. Like we don't want decentralization to such an extent that like, you know, we're basically reproducing, atomization by like, mandating that every kind of like individual be its own producer of what it needs. Like that doesn't make sense. Like that is not efficient. That is like hugely inefficient, and it would be probably more wasteful. So yeah, I guess in terms of like actual solutions, or like kind of like more concrete proposals that are offered, like as ever they kind of like go back to communization. And I feel like I'm inclined to agree with you here that like if we think about, what the protest, what the next riot wave should take as its objective, I mean, blockading kind of like logistical routes, like the flows of hydraulic capitalism, is good. Like we saw with the Suez Canal fiasco, that is like a very effective way of kind of like disrupting things. And there's like a long history, especially here in Canada, with the indigenous movements of blockading and like disrupting like the flow of commodities. That's a very effective like protest strategy, and it kind of like addresses itself to the technological level, at least like in the most like accessible way for a kind of mass movement. But yeah, as ever with this communization stuff, like we really come back. It's not so much the kind of like place that we're going to assemble as a mass protest movement. It's not like this statue that we're going to tear down, or like the building that we're going to burn, or like whatever, or like the cause that we're going to, all paint on our signs or whatever. Like the challenge is really to find some kind of like new social form, some kind of like new way
Mm,
of relating to each other. Like the challenge, the object is always like far more abstract. It's like way more difficult to kind of put your finger on. So it's kind of like difficult to kind of like make prescriptions about what the next protest wave should do, because it's just very difficult to identify in a kind of concrete sense. Like, should people be doing these more of these like temporary autonomous zones? Because like that is certainly a new way of relating to each other. Like, if you're all living in the public square, then you're certainly like relating to each other in a new way. Like, you're kind of like all talking to each other. You have like these kind of like democratic kind of like general assemblies and whatnot. But obviously, it's not like there's not much of a possibility of that lasting, in a meaningful sense. I mean, Occupy didn't last too long. Like, it's eventually going to get crushed by the state. Um, So yeah, I don't know. What do you think? Is there a way to like more precisely talk about what the hell we're talking about here? Like with this
I
new
mean,
way of like, and it's so common to say that like, oh, it needs to be discovered by the movement or something. You can't like make prescriptions about it from the past, like about the future or whatever. But I feel like there has to be a better way of talking about this. Like, what is it going to look like?
well, okay, if I was like, as you say, it's hard to predict the future, but like if someone was like, okay, what's like the most realistic way you could see like a positive next step? Let's put it that way. Like, not necessarily a solution, something I could see happening that would push things kind of in like a better direction than where they're at currently. And I think like that would probably be UBI, because UBI seems to have like a very like growing kind of social support to the point where you have like, prominent political figures in large Western nations who are at least saying like, yeah, that's something we should really aim to do. So like, I don't know how likely it is to happen. It seems like there is like some likelihood that it will at least be tried out. And I think like if you did get in that situation where there was like universal basic income, where like for the vast, the masses were suddenly like no longer required to go out and like sell their labor on the market just for basic survival, it would kind of like take some of the pressure off people's day-to-day lives. There wouldn't be this like, this endless need to participate in the charade of like, oh, you're also like a capitalist, you're also like, on equal footing with Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk. You're just, you need to like pull yourself up by your bootstraps and like just try harder. Like, I think if you did have a UBI program, like this would open up the possibility of people beginning to explore other possibilities of like living together in a more measured fashion. It'd be like similar to the spirit of something like Chaz, but more considered, where like, Chaz like had a good idea at heart. Like, it was like an attempt at some sort of like positive manifestation, but obviously it was like embarrassingly haphazard. Like, you can't just plant some tomato plants in like a town square and like expect that to be like the start of a new civilization. What you need is a lot of people who are no longer like compelled to just spend like every day working at like Walmart or at a call center or something, who now have a little bit of breathing room, like their basic survival is being taken care of, who can begin to like research and experiment with these things. Like, what I would like to see if a UBI program was implemented would be a rise in like these sort of like these communal farms that you hear about sometimes, or like people will all just like, like maybe a dozen, 2 dozen friends from the city will all chip in together and like purchase like an old farm somewhere out in the countryside, and they'll all go out there and learn to do like some organic farming and permaculture, and like, you know, learn to raise chickens and things like that. I do see that as potentially being a next step, because like if we actually envision like some sort of radically new social structure, it's like we need to actually learn how to do that. Like, you know, all we've learned our whole lives is how to be like capitalist worker drones. That's all public schooling taught us how to do. We essentially need to create new schooling for ourselves so that we actually know how to like build a world that's more in line with what we want to see. So
Yeah, I mean,
like that's what I'm hoping
yeah.
for this decade.
I'm definitely for UBI, no doubt about it, no question there. I hate work as much as the next leftist podcaster, but yeah, that is essentially a reformist political proposal. It is not revolutionary. It's not communist. Yeah, I mean, it's barely even socialist, really. And
Yeah.
yeah, I'm also like totally on board with, you know, getting a dozen or 2 dozen friends and starting a communal farm somewhere. That sounds really nice. That's basically kind of what I have going here in a very kind of on a micro scale. We have chickens, by the way. We got 5 chickens.
Nice. Nice.
Um, but yeah, like these are not really the kinds of proposals that I think Endnotes would um, endorse as, you know, socially viable, as the kinds of like reconfiguration of ways of relating to each other that are necessary. Like if everybody were to go out and, you know, live on communal farms, then who would be generating the power? Who would be, you know, mining the ore? Who would be, you know, doing all of these kinds of things that we were just talking about, like all these like technological kind of like productive things that are good and that we should maintain, but which, you know, obviously they need to be modified in some way, like just scaling them back and probably uh, changing the energy source. But yeah, I don't really think, I mean, it's nice and I'm for it, but I don't think it's like the kind of solution that we need to be looking for, really. Yeah,
Well, I
I
mean,
think political solutions are probably the political like measures, at least, are probably the most realistic way for any kind of like protest movement to, you know, do something going forward. But they're not revolutionary.
yeah, which is like why I describe this as like a potential next step rather than like the actual revolution. Like at best, I could see some sort of shift like that, like maybe at least allowing for some fresh perspective emerge, like to emerge, that could possibly engender like some actual like revolutionary
They could end
praxis.
gender. That's
And yeah, wow, no pun intended, but I'm gonna act like
that's
it
part of the
was.
that's one of the necessary communizing measures.
Yeah, like, you know, at best I would see like, okay, well maybe this would allow more people to spend more time thinking and like talking about this, because like from our current perspective, like I mean this is part of and this whole thing is like recognizing that like from our current perspective it seems like very occluded like what the revolution actually looks like, but like there still feels like this need for there to be a revolution. So if you can't see like the end goal that you want to get to, if you can't see a path to that, all you can really do is say like, okay, well then what would be at least a little bit better than what I'm currently experiencing? Because maybe once I get to that point, I'll have a little bit more perspective. So it's kind of like optimistic, and like maybe it's like overestimating like the time horizon that we have for making these changes. But like, yeah, if anybody's got like a better alternative,
Yeah, I
I'm
mean,
willing
it's true that like, you know, just lifting the boot of the system off of the throat of the proletariat, or at least like, you know, lessening, you know, the weight behind it slightly, is going to allow the proletariat to breathe more easily. You know, oxygen will go to the brain and they will be able to think. I think, yeah, like it's long been kind of like a part of radical theory, like this idea of like freeing yourself from work as much as you can so that you can spend more time, thinking about how to do a revolution. Like that is,
Mm.
an immediate first step on an individual level. And I think it's important to remember, like we're talking about UBI here, which would, free up, quite a lot of our lives. But, the George Floyd protest was uh, like calling for a defunding of the police. So like the kind of like oppression that marginalized peoples in the United States especially are facing, like the kind of like immediate relief that they're asking for is far more immediate than UBI. Like they're asking to stop being murdered by agents of the police, to stop having like you know terrorists enter into their homes, to stop being like just like profiled and like just completely like thrown into jails en masse, like all of this kind of shit. It's a lot more immediate, it's a lot more visceral and real, and like yeah, than like UBIs. So I think that like if we look at that and we like see that, and respect what the proletariat itself is asking for, then I think you're probably right that like these kinds of measures that will just like free up the proletariat a little bit, like give them some breathing room. Like first of all, like stop having them be fucking murdered in the streets by, gangs of like state shock troopers,
Mm.
is one way of doing that. And then, a further way of like really doing that is, giving them some UBI so that they are able to like, take some basic care of themselves and like not have to, work in absolute drudgery all the time. It would free up people to do more like workplace organizing. Like I think it's true that like, just freeing people up a little bit would give them a lot more room to spread out and like experiment with different types of organization and like social activity. On that note, I guess we should wrap it up here. Been going for quite some time.
Yeah.
um yeah, if you like this conversation, then there's some support on patreon.com/the inverted form. Give us a couple bucks a month. You'll get access to the Discord as well as the bonus episode when we eventually start producing those. If you want on to the Discord in any way, if you want to join in on the conversation, then just send me a DM on whatever platform of your choosing. Yeah, I can be followed on Twitter at the inverted form. Owen.
Oh yeah. Follow me on the internet at my website, which is sporadically updated, world3.tk. Also, I have music available on the internet on various record labels, Bandcamps, which are not linked to on my website. So you'll probably never be able to find them. But if you do, please purchase my vinyl and my cassettes so that I can become a wealthy capitalist and exploit the proletariat.
We're all going to become wealthy capitalists and exploit proletariats. Okay, thank you for joining us. See you next week. Goodbye.